Hey guys, tonight we're looking at a part of medieval life that sounds simple at first, but becomes stranger the longer you sit with it. The fact that for many people, privacy was not just rare, it was almost unimaginable. Not because medieval people had no feelings or no shame or no need for quiet, but because the world around them was built in ways that made being alone unusually difficult. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from tonight and what corner of history you'd like to drift into next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, leaving a like is a quiet but helpful way to support it. You can also subscribe for more calm, curious, intelligent history told at a slower pace. So let's step gently into the crowded rooms, thin walls, shared beds, open halls, and watchful villages of medieval life, where the modern idea of having your own space would have seemed less like a right and more like a luxury few people could afford. To understand medieval privacy, we have to begin with a small act that most of us barely notice today: closing a door. A bedroom door, a bathroom door, an office door, a door that says, "For a little while the world may not enter." In much of medieval Europe, that simple boundary was either absent, fragile, or shared by too many people to mean what it means now. A door did not always lead to a private room. A room did not always belong to one person. And a household was rarely just a neat little family tucked away from everyone else. This does not mean medieval people were primitive, careless, or somehow less inward than we are. That is one of the easy mistakes. They had secrets. They had embarrassment. They had grief they did not want observed, prayers they whispered, desires they concealed, arguments they wished others had not heard. But the structures of life were different. Space was expensive. Heat was precious. Light was limited. Security mattered. Work and home were often mixed together. And society itself was built on visibility. People knew one another's business because reputation, survival, marriage, labor, credit, and trust all depended on being known. For the poor, the problem was not usually philosophical. It was physical. A peasant cottage might be one main room, sometimes with a loft, sometimes with a partition, sometimes with animals nearby or even under the same roof. The fire was central. The hearth was warmth, cooking place, gathering point, and evening light. People slept near it because heat mattered more than separation. Beds, if a household had them, were valuable possessions, not casual personal furniture. Sharing a bed was ordinary. Parents, children, servants, guests, and kin might sleep in arrangements that feel startlingly crowded to a modern listener, but made practical sense in a world where bedding was costly and winter was not gentle. Even the word bedroom can mislead us if we imagine a modern private chamber. For many medieval people, sleeping was not a solitary retreat. It was part of the household rhythm. Bodies lay near bodies. Someone coughed. Someone turned. A baby cried. An older relative muttered in sleep. A servant rose early. A visitor arrived late. The night was not silent, and it was rarely sealed. And yet, this crowdedness was not only a condition of poverty. Even in castles and manor houses, privacy was limited in ways that surprise people. A lord might have more chambers, more curtains, more servants, more control over who entered, but he was also constantly attended. Status did not always mean solitude. In fact, high status often meant the opposite. Important people were watched, helped, dressed, advised, guarded, and accompanied. A noble household was a working institution, full of retainers, clerks, cooks, grooms, pages, chaplains, ladies-in-waiting, messengers, and guests. Power attracted people. The higher one stood, the harder it could be to disappear. This is one of the quiet reversals of medieval privacy. The poorest lacked privacy because they lacked space. The powerful lacked privacy because they had too many people depending on access to them. A king or lord might withdraw into an inner chamber, But even that withdrawal was structured, witnessed, and guarded. To be seen was part of authority. To eat in public, receive people, sit in hall, hear petitions, and move through a household with attendants was not merely inconvenience. It was government, hierarchy, and performance. The Great Hall, so often romanticized in films, was not just a dramatic room with banners and fires. It was a social engine. People ate there, waited there, slept there, negotiated there, heard news there, and measured rank by placement. A hall could be magnificent, but it was also noisy, smoky, and communal. The lord at the high table was elevated, but not hidden. Servants moved constantly. Dogs might wander beneath tables. Strangers might be admitted under certain customs of hospitality. Musicians, clerks, petitioners, travelers, and household officers all had reasons to be present. The household breathed in public. For ordinary town dwellers, privacy was shaped by another force: density. Medieval towns were smaller than modern cities, but their streets could be crowded, narrow, and intensely social. Houses were often workshops as well as homes. A baker, tailor, smith, brewer, or merchant might live above, behind, or beside the space where business took place. Apprentices and servants might sleep under the same roof. Customers came and went. Neighbors could hear quarrels through walls or windows. Smells crossed boundaries easily. So did sound. A medieval street was not a clean division between public and private. Work spilled outward. Goods were displayed. Doors opened to lanes. Windows without glass, shutters, and thin partitions allowed noise to travel. People watched from thresholds. They noticed who visited whom, who bought what, who drank too much, who owed money, who was courting, who was ill, who had failed to attend church. A private life existed, but it was constantly pressed upon by the eyes and ears of others. This constant visibility could be comforting as well as oppressive. It is important to hold both ideas together. In a world without modern police forces, insurance systems, reliable hospitals, or social safety nets, being embedded in a community could be protection. Neighbors could help in childbirth, fire, sickness, hunger, and danger. They could lend tools, witness agreements, remember debts, and testify to character. Privacy, in the modern sense, often depends on institutions that allow us to survive without being known intimately by everyone around us. Medieval people often needed to be known, but being known could also be a cage. Reputation was not a soft matter. It could determine whether someone found work, credit, marriage, mercy, or trust. In villages, where land, labor, and family ties overlapped, a person's conduct was rarely invisible. Church courts, manorial courts, and local custom all depended on testimony. What people saw and heard mattered. A whispered scandal could become a formal accusation. A quarrel heard through a wall could become evidence. A suspicious visit at night could alter a woman's prospects or a man's standing. The community remembered. There is a temptation to imagine medieval people as simply accepting this, as if they did not mind being watched. But the surviving records suggest something subtler. People cared intensely about honor, shame, insult, secrecy, and public reputation. They sued over slander. They guarded sexual reputations. They concealed pregnancies, debts, thefts, forbidden relationships, and unpopular beliefs. They used darkness, distance, curtains, locked chests, coded language, confession, pilgrimage, and temporary absence as ways of managing exposure. They may not have possessed privacy as a broad modern right, but they knew the value of concealment. The Church added another layer to this world. On the one hand, medieval Christianity brought the idea of inwardness into daily life. Conscience, confession, sin, intention, the hidden state of the soul. God saw what neighbors could not, In that sense, no one was ever truly private. The most secret thought could be spiritually visible. On the other hand, confession created a remarkable kind of protected speech. To confess privately to a priest was not the same as speaking in a crowded hall or before a court. It offered a space, however structured and religious, where hidden things could be named. That is one reason medieval privacy cannot be measured only by architecture. A person might have no room of their own, but still have inner spaces shaped by prayer, memory, shame, fear, and conscience. The medieval world was physically communal, yet spiritually attentive to the hidden self. This contradiction is part of what makes it so fascinating. People lived in close quarters, but they were not without interior lives. They were watched by neighbors, but also taught that the most important watcher was divine. Still, the physical world mattered, and nowhere does that become more intimate than in washing, dressing, and bodily needs. Modern viewers often ask, with understandable discomfort, how people managed the most private bodily acts. The answer varies enormously by class, place, period, and setting, but the general pattern is clear. Privacy was usually improvised rather than guaranteed. Chamber pots, shared latrines, garderobes in castles, cesspits in towns, and outdoor spaces in rural areas all placed bodily life much closer to ordinary social life than most modern people would tolerate. In a castle, a garderobe might project from a wall, carrying waste downward into a pit, moat, or chute. It sounds private because it was built into stone, but privacy depended on access, placement, and rank. In towns, latrines could be shared between households. In poorer homes, a chamber pot could be used and emptied with little ceremony. Smell, waste, and bodily maintenance were not hidden with the same systems of plumbing and sealed rooms we rely on today. The body was more present. It announced itself. This does not mean people were indifferent to cleanliness. That is another oversimplification. Medieval people washed hands, faces, and clothes when circumstances allowed. Bathhouses existed in many towns, though their reputations and fortunes changed over time. Linen undergarments helped manage cleanliness. Etiquette texts advised decent conduct at table and in company. People noticed bad smells and poor manners, but they inhabited a world where water had to be carried, fuel had to be gathered, soap was not equally available to all, and drainage was limited. Cleanliness was desired, but constrained. Clothing also belonged to this shared world. Dressing could be assisted, especially among elites, and garments themselves were layered signs of rank, modesty, labor, and identity. To be dressed by servants might sound luxurious, but it meant one's body and habits were known to others. The intimate routines of the powerful were not always private. They were managed. A noblewoman's chamber might be more secluded than a hall, but it was still a place of attendance, conversation, preparation, and supervision. A lord's chamber might contain a bed, chests, documents, and fine textiles, but also servants entering with food, water, clothes, messages, and news. The bed itself had meanings we have partly lost. In elite households, beds could be public symbols. A grand bed with hangings was not merely for sleep. It represented wealth, lineage, hospitality, and status. Curtains around a bed offered warmth and some visual privacy, but not necessarily silence or solitude. They created a small world inside a larger one, a fabric boundary rather than a locked personal room. The rustle of people outside remained. The household continued. For many people, the most private object was not a room but a chest. A locked chest could hold money, documents, clothes, tools, devotional items, letters, or keepsakes. Locks mattered. Keys mattered. The ability to secure even a small space could be deeply significant. In a crowded household, a chest might be a person's closest thing to a private domain. It did not give solitude, but it gave control. It said, "These things are mine, and not every eye may enter." And here we come to a quieter form of privacy, the privacy of possessions. In a world of shared rooms and shared beds, ownership could become a boundary. A belt pouch, a locked box, a sealed letter, a folded cloth, a hidden coin, a small book of hours, a personal rosary, a knife, a ring, a token from a lover or parent. These could carry private meaning. Medieval people might not have had much personal space, but they had personal attachments. The difference matters. Children grew up in this world of exposure. A child in a medieval household did not usually inhabit a separate nursery in the modern middle-class sense. They learned by proximity, by watching adults work, quarrel, pray, trade, cook, mend, flirt, bargain, and mourn. Childhood was not without affection, but it was less protected from adult realities. Birth, illness, death, animal slaughter, hunger, pregnancy, labor, and conflict were all more visible. The household was the school of life because life was happening all around them. This visibility shaped manners. If one cannot rely on walls for privacy, one must rely more on conduct. Courtesy, restraint, shame, and hierarchy helped manage crowded living. People learned when to look away, when to speak softly, when not to mention what everyone had noticed. In some ways, medieval privacy was social rather than architectural. It depended not only on being alone, but on others agreeing not to intrude too far. That agreement could fail, of course. Gossip was powerful precisely because everyone knew there were things one was not supposed to expose. Marriage reveals the tension sharply. A marriage was intimate but also public. It joined families, property, labor, inheritance, and reputation. Weddings were witnessed. Bedding ceremonies in some regions and classes could make the transition into married sexuality socially visible, though practices varied and are often exaggerated in popular imagination. The central point is not that every marriage was crudely exposed, but that private life carried public consequences. Fertility, legitimacy, household order, and inheritance were community concerns. What happened between two people could matter to many more. For women especially, the lack of privacy could be dangerous. Female reputation was watched closely, and sexual suspicion could be socially devastating. Servants, widows, young unmarried women, wives separated from husbands, women working in taverns or markets, and women living in crowded households all navigated a world where being seen in the wrong place, with the wrong person at the wrong time, could become a story told by others. Privacy was not distributed equally. Some people needed it more because they were judged more harshly, and yet had less power to claim it. Servants also lived with limited boundaries. In both rural and urban households, servants were often resident workers. They slept where space allowed, followed household rhythms, and were subject to supervision. Their labor took place in intimate proximity to employers. They knew family secrets and were also vulnerable to accusation. A servant might overhear, observe, carry messages, hide relationships, or become the object of suspicion. The household depended on them, but rarely granted them autonomy in the modern sense. Apprentices in towns faced a similar loss of separation. To be apprenticed was not simply to learn a trade. It was to live under authority. The master's house was workplace, school, home, and moral environment. An apprentice's time, conduct, movement, and associations could all be regulated. The arrangement provided training and belonging, but also constant oversight. The private young self had little room to unfold away from adult judgment. And yet, medieval people found margins. They went to fields, wells, woods, churches, markets, riverbanks, mills, and roads. They met under cover of work. They spoke while fetching water. They exchanged glances at church. They used feast days, fairs, pilgrimages, and seasonal labor to step outside ordinary surveillance. Movement created temporary privacy. So did noise. A crowded marketplace could hide a conversation better than a quiet cottage. A church could expose a person to the eyes of the parish, but also allow private prayer in a corner. The same spaces that watched people could sometimes shelter them. Night mattered too. Darkness in the medieval world was deeper than most modern urban darkness. Without electric light, night altered the rules. Could be frightening, dangerous, and morally suspicious, but also useful. Lovers, thieves, rebels, fugitives, and ordinary people seeking secrecy used darkness as cover. Communities often distrusted unnecessary movement after dark because night loosened visibility. Curfews, watchmen, locked gates, and household routines were partly attempts to restore social control once the sun removed the eyes of the day. So the story of medieval privacy is not simply that people had none. It is that privacy was uneven, negotiated, fragile, and often temporary. It appeared in curtains, corners, chests, whispered confession, darkness, distance, silence, and the mercy of others choosing not to notice. It was not yet the settled architecture of everyday life. It had to be made moment by moment inside a world built for closeness. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is that closeness itself was not always experienced as misery. Modern people often imagine medieval crowdedness only as discomfort, and much of it was. The smells, noise, lack of solitude, and constant observation could be exhausting. But closeness also meant warmth, help, memory, shared labor, shared food, and human presence in a world where isolation could be dangerous. To be alone was not always freedom. Sometimes it was vulnerability. That is why medieval people did not simply lack privacy in the way someone might lack a convenience. They lived within a different balance of needs. Warmth competed with solitude. Safety competed with secrecy. Reputation competed with individuality. Community competed with personal space. And the household, more than almost anything else, was where those tensions became daily life. As we move further into that household, the next question becomes even more revealing. What did it actually feel like, hour by hour, to live among so many listening ears? Because the absence of privacy was not just about where people slept. It shaped how they argued, how they loved, how they worked, how they prayed, and how carefully they learned to manage the parts of themselves that others might see. And in many ways, that management began with sound. Modern privacy often depends on walls thick enough to absorb ordinary life. Medieval buildings rarely offered that luxury. A conversation in one corner of a house could drift into another. Floorboards creaked. Doors rattled. Animals shifted below. Wind entered through shutters. Fires cracked in the hearth. A visitor arriving late at night might wake an entire household simply by entering. Silence itself was uncommon enough that people noticed it. This mattered because hearing was one of the main ways communities understood one another. Long before official records reached deeply into ordinary life, people learned through listening. They knew which couples fought often, which households stayed unnaturally quiet, which servant crept downstairs after dark, which tradesman was drinking away his earnings at the tavern, which family had begun whispering anxiously after harvest failures. The household was porous not only physically, but acoustically. There are medieval court records that reveal astonishing levels of overheard detail. Neighbors testified about arguments heard through walls, suspicious sounds during the night, words spoken during drunken quarrels, crying infants, accusations exchanged between spouses, and muttered insults that traveled farther than the speaker intended. In some villages, Houses stood so closely together that windows nearly faced one another across narrow lanes. People lived within hearing distance of other lives. This created a strange tension. Medieval society valued household order very deeply. A disciplined home reflected moral stability, economic competence, and social respectability. Yet the very architecture of ordinary life made disorder difficult to conceal. Anger leaked outward. So did grief. So did fear. And perhaps nowhere was this more emotionally complicated than within marriage itself. A medieval marriage was not usually expected to satisfy modern ideals of emotional privacy or personal fulfillment. It was practical, economic, religious, social, and familial all at once. Yet husbands and wives still formed attachments, loyalties, resentments, habits, and private understandings with one another. The difficulty was that truly private emotional space could be hard to find. A couple might sleep in a shared room with children nearby, servants within earshot, or relatives separated only by a hanging cloth. Arguments could become household events. Reconciliation could happen under observation. Affection itself might be moderated by awareness that others were present. Even noble couples, despite larger residences, often lived within complex domestic networks that limited solitude. At the same time, this closeness produced forms of intimacy unfamiliar to modern life. Families spent extraordinary amounts of time physically near one another. Work was shared. Meals were shared. Evenings gathered around the same fire. There were fewer opportunities to vanish into separate rooms, separate devices, separate worlds of entertainment. Medieval households could feel suffocating, but they could also feel intensely interconnected. The fire at the center of the home shaped much of this experience. In colder regions especially, heat determined behavior. One did not casually wander into distant and used rooms in winter if fuel was scarce. People clustered where warmth existed. Light gathered there too. After sunset, the glow of the hearth often became the center of social life. Repairs were made. Stories were told. Food was prepared. Clothing was mended. Children listened while adults spoke about rents, weather, gossip, debts, marriages, or rumors from nearby towns. The modern fantasy of disappearing into private comfort simply did not fit this environment. To stay warm was to stay together. And medieval nights themselves were longer and stranger than many people imagine. Without electric lighting, darkness transformed human rhythms. People often slept in patterns that feel unfamiliar now. Historians debate details and regional variation, but there is strong evidence that many people experience segmented sleep, waking for periods during the night before returning to rest. During these waking hours, people prayed, spoke quietly, checked animals, tended fires, reflected, or sometimes visited neighbors. That meant the household never entirely disappeared into unconscious silence. Someone was often awake. Imagine a winter night in a small village cottage. Wind pressing against the outer walls. Smoke lingering faintly in the rafters. A child murmuring in sleep. Someone coughing persistently from illness. The soft movement of straw bedding. A servant rising early to prepare bread. Outside, perhaps a dog barking somewhere beyond the darkness. Privacy in such a world was not a stable condition, came in fragments. Even illness unfolded publicly. A sick person was rarely isolated in a modern medical sense. Care happened within the household itself. Relatives, neighbors, servants, or religious figures might all witness suffering directly. Fevers, injuries, childbirth complications, and death occurred close to ordinary daily life. Children saw them. Household members heard them through the night. This closeness to sickness shaped medieval emotional life in ways that are difficult to recreate today. Disease was not hidden behind institutional walls. Death was not professionally managed at a distance. A dying person often remained physically present within the home until the end. Final confessions, prayers, and farewells happened in spaces where others continued living, cooking, and sleeping. And death itself did not always create privacy afterward. Medieval mourning was communal. Bells rang publicly. Funerals involved neighbors and kin. Burial grounds sat close to churches at the center of communities. Memory was collective. People expected to be remembered through prayers, rituals, family obligations, and public acts of devotion. Even the boundary between the living and dead felt socially shared. This may be one reason medieval people often developed stronger habits of emotional restraint in public settings. Not because they lacked emotion, but because so much of life occurred under observation. Courtesy literature from the later medieval period repeatedly encouraged moderation. Do not laugh too loudly, do not stare excessively, do not spit carelessly at table, do not expose bodily functions openly, do not interrupt, do not speak crudely in noble company. These rules were partly about hierarchy, but they were also about survival in crowded environments. Manners became a technology of coexistence. At the table especially, privacy almost disappeared entirely. Meals were social performances governed by rank and expectation. In noble households, seating arrangements visibly reinforced hierarchy. In poorer homes, shared dishes and limited utensils created unavoidable physical closeness. Eating was rarely solitary. One's habits at table could influence reputation significantly, and food itself carried social visibility. In villages, neighbors noticed shortages. They noticed sudden abundance too. Brewing, baking, slaughtering animals, preserving food, and preparing feasts all created smells and activity that traveled outward into communal awareness. A household's condition could often be sensed before a word was spoken. Even literacy, limited though it was for much of the medieval period, had complicated relationships with privacy. Letters existed, certainly, but they were not always intimate in the modern sense. Many people could not write independently, which meant dictation was sometimes necessary. A clerk, scribe, priest, or educated associate might assist in producing correspondence. Seals offered security, but not absolute confidentiality. Documents could pass through many hands. Books themselves were precious objects, often read aloud rather than silently consumed in isolation. Reading as a deeply private interior act became more common gradually over centuries, especially as literacy expanded and books became more available. But in much of medieval society, knowledge circulated communally through speech, preaching, recitation, song, and memory. This is another important reversal from modern assumptions. Today, we often associate individuality with privacy and literacy. Medieval individuality certainly existed, but it developed within far more collective forms of communication. People absorbed stories, law, morality, religion, and local history together. The voice mattered more than the isolated reader. And then there was the church itself, perhaps the most paradoxical institution in medieval privacy. The church regulated deeply personal matters: marriage, sexuality, morality, confession, inheritance, even aspects of daily conduct. It observed people closely through ritual participation and communal expectation. Yet it also created one of the few recognized protected spaces for hidden truth. Confession offered something rare: structured secrecy. The seal of confession was treated with extraordinary seriousness. A priest who revealed confessed sins risked severe consequences. For ordinary medieval people living under constant communal observation, confession may have provided one of the only socially legitimate opportunities to speak openly about thoughts and actions that could not safely be discussed elsewhere. But even here, privacy was incomplete. Confession was not modern therapeutic confidentiality. It existed within religious authority. Sin still belonged to a moral order larger than the individual. The hidden self mattered, but not because it was autonomous in the modern sense. It mattered because it stood before God. That distinction shaped medieval inwardness profoundly. People examined conscience intensely while still understanding themselves primarily as members of households, communities, and spiritual hierarchies. The self was real but relational, and this becomes especially visible when we look at punishment and public shame. Many medieval punishments relied on visibility. Stocks, pillories, public penance, ritual humiliation, and formal apologies all turned the body into a social lesson. Justice was often designed not merely to isolate offenders, but to expose them. Honor could be damaged publicly because honor itself existed publicly. A person caught stealing might be displayed before neighbors. A moral offense could require visible repentance. Even clothing sometimes signaled shame or legal status. Communities believed behavior improved partly through observation and memory. Yet public punishment also reveals how much medieval people feared humiliation. Shame worked because reputation mattered deeply. To lose standing in a tightly connected society could threaten marriage prospects, trade relationships, employment, protection, or survival itself. And rumors moved quickly. Markets, taverns, wells, bakehouses, mills, and churchyards functioned as information networks long before newspapers existed. Travelers carried news between regions, but local gossip carried equal force. A suspicious death, a failed marriage negotiation, a dishonest merchant, an unusual illness, a priest behaving improperly, a servant dismissed unexpectedly. All became subjects of communal interpretation. The tavern in particular occupied an interesting place between public and private life. It was social, noisy, and semi-public, yet people often spoke more freely there than elsewhere. Alcohol loosened restraint. Deals were made. Conflicts erupted. Friendships formed. Songs, complaints, and political frustrations circulated in spaces authorities sometimes struggled to fully control. For women, taverns could be complicated spaces, especially depending on class and occupation. Alewives and female innkeepers participated actively in economic life, but visibility could also invite suspicion. Again and again, medieval privacy intersected with power. Those with less social protection were watched more harshly. Travel offered another temporary escape from ordinary scrutiny. Pilgrimages especially allowed people to step outside familiar village identities. A traveler could move among strangers, encounter new customs, and briefly exist beyond the constant memory of neighbors. Pilgrimage was religious, but also social and psychological. It created movement through a world where most lives were geographically narrow. But travel brought vulnerability too. Inns were shared spaces. Roads were dangerous. Sleeping arrangements were communal. Personal possessions had to be guarded carefully. Strangers observed one another closely because trust was uncertain. Even among the wealthy, complete privacy remained elusive partly because servants were everywhere. Servants lit fires, carried water, prepared beds, emptied chamber pots, washed linens, assisted with clothing, delivered messages, and managed daily logistics. They became invisible in one sense and deeply informed in another. Elite households depended on people who witnessed intimate routines constantly. A nobleman discussing politics in what he believed was a private chamber might still be overheard by attendants. A lady receiving confidential letters relied on servants for delivery. Household staff moved quietly through corridors carrying knowledge with them. Some servants became trusted confidants. Others carried stories outward, and architecture itself slowly began responding to these tensions. By the later medieval period, especially among elites, homes in some regions gradually developed more specialized rooms and corridors. Instead of everyone moving through shared central spaces constantly, layouts slowly evolved toward greater separation of functions. Private chambers became more significant. Withdrawal itself became a visible marker of status. But this process was uneven and incomplete. The fully privatized domestic world familiar to many modern people remained centuries away. For now, medieval life continued to unfold in overlapping layers of observation, necessity, and negotiated boundaries. People carved out moments of secrecy where they could. Behind curtains, in gardens, during walks to fields, in whispered prayers, in hidden letters, in glances exchanged across crowded rooms. And sometimes, perhaps most interestingly, privacy appeared not through physical isolation, but through mutual agreement. Communities often survived because people chose not to expose everything they knew. A neighbor might hear an argument and say nothing. A servant might notice a forbidden romance and remain silent. A priest might recognize hidden suffering beneath ordinary appearances. A family might quietly conceal illness or debt from wider attention. Silence itself became a social skill, because medieval people understood something modern viewers occasionally forget. When everyone lives close together, mercy sometimes depends on pretending not to see too much. And nowhere would that fragile balance between observation and concealment become more delicate than inside the growing medieval town, where commerce, ambition, migration, and crowded living conditions created entire new forms of social exposure that older village life had never fully prepared people for. And in those growing towns, privacy became tangled not only with survival and reputation, but with opportunity. A medieval village could be restrictive because everyone knew everyone else, often across generations. A town, by contrast, introduced strangers. Newcomers arrived seeking work, protection, trade, apprenticeship, or escape from rural obligations. For some people, especially runaway serfs or younger sons with little inheritance, the town offered something almost revolutionary, the possibility of partial reinvention. But anonymity in the medieval town was never complete. In fact, the larger and more crowded urban world often produced new forms of scrutiny rather than true invisibility. Guilds tracked membership. Parish communities monitored attendance and behavior. Neighbors observed one another from tightly packed homes. Officials recorded taxes, rents, and commercial obligations. And because towns depended heavily on trust in trade, a person's reputation still traveled quickly through workshops, taverns, markets, and churchyards. The difference was that urban life created overlapping identities. A person might be known differently by a landlord, a guild master, a fellow craftsman, a drinking companion, and a parish priest. That fragmentation allowed small pockets of personal maneuvering that village life sometimes did not. Still, medieval towns were intensely physical places. Streets could be narrow, muddy, loud, and crowded with movement from dawn onward. Animals passed through regularly. Waste disposal remained inconsistent. Bells marked hours of labor, worship, warning, and curfew. Market stalls filled public spaces with negotiation and argument. And inside many homes, the line between business and domestic life barely existed at all. A shoemaker's customers might enter the same building where his children slept. A brewer's production space might sit beside the family hearth. Apprentices worked, ate, and slept under the authority of their master. Journeymen rented beds where they could. Lodgers shared space with relatives and strangers alike. The result was a world in which people were constantly shifting between public and semi-private roles without fully leaving either behind. One of the quieter realities of medieval urban life was how little uninterrupted solitude most people experienced. Even moments that appear private to us now were often shared. Washing, Dressing, eating, working, and sleeping all happened within communal rhythms. To truly be alone for long periods could even appear suspicious under certain circumstances. This becomes especially interesting when we consider emotion. Modern societies often assume emotions belong primarily to the private self. Medieval emotional life worked differently. Grief, anger, celebration, devotion, shame, and reconciliation were frequently collective experiences. Funerals drew communities together. Religious festivals filled streets with public ritual. Legal disputes unfolded before witnesses. Even reconciliation between enemies could become formal and visible. This did not mean medieval people lacked inner complexity. Far from it. Letters, devotional writings, poems, and legal testimony all reveal people wrestling deeply with fear, loneliness, desire, guilt, and longing. But emotional life unfolded within a society that expected much of the self to remain socially embedded. And nowhere was that more visible than during childbirth. For modern listeners, childbirth often belongs to hospitals, private medical settings, and carefully controlled access. Medieval childbirth was overwhelmingly domestic and communal. Women gave birth surrounded by female relatives, neighbors, servants, or local midwives. Men were usually excluded from the birthing space itself, but the event remained deeply social. The birthing room could become crowded, hot, anxious, and prayerful. Candles burned. Water was heated. Religious objects might be brought near. Women shared practical knowledge passed down through generations. Childbirth was dangerous enough that communities treated it as a serious collective concern. Privacy during labor was limited not because medieval people were indifferent to modesty, but because survival often required assistance. A solitary birth would have been terrifyingly risky. This pattern repeated across much of life. Practical necessity frequently outweighed personal separation. Even sleep, which modern people often treat as the ultimate private retreat, remained socially exposed in surprising ways. Inns especially reveal this clearly. Travelers often shared beds with strangers simply because space was limited and accommodation expensive. To modern minds, this can sound unbearable, but contemporaries were more accustomed to negotiated bodily proximity. That does not mean they enjoyed every aspect of it. Complaints about snoring, drunken behavior, theft, fleas, smells, and intrusive companions certainly existed. Medieval humor and literature contain plenty of irritation about uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. But the expectation of fully private rest belonged largely to the wealthy, and even they experienced it inconsistently. The wealthy, in fact, occupied a curious position in the history of privacy. They possessed larger homes, private chambers, servants to enforce boundaries, and greater control over access. Yet their status also attracted constant attention. A powerful noble household functioned almost like a small political organism. Visitors arrived regularly. Messengers came and went. Servants circulated continuously. Alliances were negotiated through hospitality. Meals displayed rank. Bedrooms themselves could become semi-political spaces. The king's chamber, for example, was not merely a bedroom in the modern sense. It could operate as a center of governance, patronage, intimacy, and influence. Access to the ruler's personal space carried political significance. Those allowed physically near the monarch often gained social power precisely because closeness mattered. This is one of the strangest reversals for modern audiences. Today, privacy is often associated with power. In much of medieval society, visibility itself could be a form of power. To be publicly accessible, surrounded by attendants, and visibly central to the social order reinforced authority. At the same time, rulers and nobles constantly feared betrayal, espionage, poisoning, and conspiracy. Their lives were highly exposed. Servants overheard conversations. Courtiers observed rivalries. Alliances shifted quietly through whispers in corridors and chambers. Secrecy became valuable precisely because so many people lived in close proximity to power. Curtains, screens, private chapels, locked chests, coded letters, and controlled access all became tools for managing information. Medieval elites did seek privacy, but often not for emotional solitude in the modern sense. They sought it for political strategy, security, and selective intimacy. And selective intimacy mattered enormously. Friendships in the medieval world could become intensely significant because trustworthy privacy was rare. A reliable confidant was valuable. Monastic writings, personal correspondence, and courtly literature all reveal deep anxieties about betrayal, gossip, and divided loyalties. To share a secret safely was a meaningful act. Monasteries themselves offer another fascinating contradiction. Many modern people imagine monasteries as isolated places of silence and solitude. In reality, medieval monastic life was highly communal and highly regulated. Monks and nuns followed structured schedules governing prayer, meals, sleep, labor, and worship. Individual privacy was often deliberately restricted as part of spiritual discipline. Dormitories were commonly shared, especially in earlier periods. Silence rules controlled speech. Personal possessions were limited. Obedience to collective routine mattered deeply. The goal was not self-expression through privacy, but spiritual order through disciplined communal life. And yet monasteries also cultivated inward reflection more systematically than much of wider medieval society. Reading, prayer, contemplation, confession, and meditation encouraged careful attention to interior spiritual experience. Monastic culture helped preserve and deepen the idea that a hidden inner life mattered profoundly, even while material privacy remained constrained. This tension between outer exposure and inner inwardness sits at the heart of medieval privacy. People could rarely control who physically surrounded them, but they still developed mental, emotional, and spiritual boundaries. A prayer silently repeated, a memory carefully protected, a longing never spoken aloud, a fear confessed only to God. The inner self survived even where walls did not. Children learned these distinctions gradually. A medieval child grew up observing adult labor and social behavior closely. There were fewer attempts to shield children from economic realities or bodily processes. But children also learned quickly that some things were spoken openly while others required discretion. A daughter might understand the dangers of gossip long before adulthood. A son apprenticed into trade learned how reputation affected business. Servant children navigating elite households learned to observe without appearing to observe. Silence itself could become a survival skill, and there were many things people preferred not to discuss openly. Debt, for example, could be deeply humiliating. Yet medieval economies often depended heavily on credit and informal lending. Financial troubles might gradually become visible through changes in diet, clothing, household goods, or social behavior. Neighbors noticed absences from market. Merchants remembered unpaid obligations. The social visibility of economic decline created enormous pressure. Likewise, illness carried layers of exposure. Some diseases produced visible symptoms that communities interpreted morally as well as medically. Leprosy, though frequently misunderstood in modern imagination, illustrates how physical conditions could affect social belonging. Fear of contagion mixed with religious symbolism and public anxiety. The body itself became readable, but medieval people also protected one another through selective blindness. Families concealed embarrassing conditions. Communities sometimes quietly tolerated behavior they officially condemned. Reputation was fragile enough that mercy occasionally required collective restraint. That restraint becomes especially visible when studying illicit relationships. Affairs, premarital intimacy, prostitution, and unofficial partnerships all existed despite religious and legal restrictions. Urban anonymity sometimes expanded opportunities for secrecy, but secrecy remained difficult. Landlords noticed visitors. Servants carried information. Neighbors watched doorways. Tavern gossip spread rapidly. Yet historians repeatedly encounter evidence of communities quietly negotiating around these realities. Not every violation produced scandal. Not every rumor became accusation. Much depended on status, discretion, economic usefulness, and communal tolerance. In this sense, medieval privacy was not simply absent. It was socially negotiated. A household might know more than it admitted publicly. A village might tolerate behavior that technically violated official morality. A parish priest might quietly ignore certain realities to preserve stability. Privacy emerged not from guaranteed rights, but from layers of discretion, hierarchy, necessity, and selective silence. And as towns grew wealthier toward the later medieval centuries, architecture itself slowly began reflecting changing desires. Merchants with rising fortunes built larger homes with separate chambers. Wealthy urban families invested in more specialized domestic spaces. Windows improved gradually in some regions. Locks became more sophisticated. Hall-centered living slowly evolved toward more divided interiors. These changes were uneven and slow, but they reveal something important. Medieval people did value forms of separation when resources allowed. The dream of controlling access to one's own life was not purely modern. It simply remained difficult to achieve consistently within medieval material realities. And material realities governed almost everything. Fuel shortages meant families gathered together for warmth. Expensive construction limited spacious housing. Labor demands kept households economically collective. Dangerous roads encouraged hospitality and shared lodging. Religious culture emphasized communal identity. Weak infrastructure reduced physical separation. The medieval world was not designed for isolated individuals moving privately through anonymous systems. It was built around interdependence, which is why moments of true solitude could feel unusually powerful. A shepherd alone with animals outside the village. A monk awake before dawn in silent prayer. A widow sitting briefly beside a dying fire after others had fallen asleep. A traveler pausing on an empty road between towns. A noblewoman reading quietly in a private chamber while servants waited beyond the door. These moments existed, but they stood out precisely because ordinary life was so shared. And perhaps that is why medieval literature and religion often treated withdrawal with such intensity. Hermits, anchorites, wandering pilgrims, and desert saints fascinated medieval imagination because they represented rare forms of chosen separation from society. An anchoress enclosed in a small cell beside a church lived under extraordinary restriction, yet paradoxically also possessed a degree of solitude unavailable to many ordinary people. Visitors came seeking wisdom through windows in the wall, but the enclosed life itself carried spiritual prestige. Voluntary isolation seemed both frightening and holy because most lives unfolded in constant human proximity. Still, even holy solitude rarely meant complete disconnection. Medieval society continually pulled people back into networks of obligation, observation, and exchange. And nowhere would those pressures become more psychologically complicated than during moments of accusation, suspicion, and fear, when entire communities turned their attention toward hidden behavior they believed threatened the fragile order holding medieval life together. And when fear entered a medieval community, privacy could collapse with startling speed. A rumor alone could alter the atmosphere of an entire street or village. People who had lived beside one another for years might suddenly begin interpreting ordinary behavior through suspicion. A woman known for herbal remedies could become unsettling during an unexplained illness. A servant who spoke too little might appear secretive rather than merely shy. A traveler arriving at the wrong moment could attract distrust simply because nobody knew enough about him. In tightly connected societies, uncertainty itself was dangerous. Medieval communities depended heavily on predictability. People needed to know who belonged, who could be trusted, who followed accepted patterns of worship and conduct, and who fit within familiar social expectations. Hidden behavior unsettled that fragile order. This is one reason accusations involving secrecy carried such emotional force. Heresy, sorcery, poisoning, theft, adultery, hidden pregnancies, false identity, covert religious practice, counterfeit trade goods, concealed disease, all represented anxieties about things happening out of sight. Medieval society was not merely uncomfortable with privacy. In some situations, it actively feared what privacy might contain. And yet the irony is that people simultaneously needed hidden spaces in order to survive emotionally and socially. A forbidden relationship required secrecy. Political dissent required secrecy. Debt might require concealment. Religious doubt, private grief, family conflict, sexual identity, or quiet resentment toward authority all often depended upon carefully managed silence. Medieval people lived inside a culture that feared concealment while constantly practicing it. That contradiction becomes particularly vivid during periods of instability. In times of famine, plague, war, or political unrest, communities often became more watchful. Ordinary habits suddenly mattered. Who stored grain secretly? Who left town unexpectedly? Who failed to attend church? Who spoke against local authority? Fear sharpened observation. The Black Death intensified many of these tendencies dramatically. When plague swept across Europe in the 14th century, medieval assumptions about household life, bodily exposure, and communal closeness collided with catastrophe. The disease spread through networks of trade, proximity, and movement that structured everyday life itself. Homes became places not only of warmth and familiarity, but of terrifying vulnerability. Families watched one another fall ill within shared rooms. Priests entered infected homes to hear confessions. Neighbors observed doors marked by sickness. Entire households could disappear within days. Privacy became almost impossible under the pressure of collective fear. Yet the plague also revealed how emotionally dependent medieval people were on human closeness. Despite fear of infection, many continued caring for relatives, spouses, children, and neighbors because abandoning them violated deeply rooted social and religious expectations. Accounts from the period repeatedly describe both selfish avoidance and astonishing acts of intimate care. A mother remained beside a feverish child. A servant stayed with an infected household. Clergy continued hearing confessions. Gravediggers worked among the dead. Physical proximity became deadly, but human bonds remained difficult to break. At the same time, plague intensified observation of the body itself. Symptoms mattered enormously. Swellings, fevers, coughing, weakness, strange discolorations. People watched for signs constantly. The body became a visible source of fear and interpretation. And because medieval medicine lacked modern germ theory, communities often searched anxiously for moral, environmental, or social explanations. Suspicion sometimes fell upon outsiders, minorities, travelers, or marginalized groups. Fear pushed societies toward surveillance. One of the quieter psychological consequences of plague may have been a growing desire among some elites for greater domestic separation afterward. Over generations, wealthy households increasingly experimented with more private arrangements, retreats from crowded urban environments, and architectural distinctions between social and intimate space. But those changes came slowly. For ordinary people, communal living remained unavoidable. Even as towns expanded and trade networks deepened, economic reality kept most households densely inhabited. Servants, apprentices, lodgers, extended kin, and workers continued sharing space. And because so much of life happened publicly, medieval people became highly skilled at reading small signals. Clothing could indicate prosperity, grief, widowhood, occupation, or moral reputation. A damaged shoe, a stained sleeve, a missing belt knife, or unusually fine fabric all communicated information. Faces were familiar, patterns were remembered, sudden changes attracted notice. In many towns, church attendance itself functioned as a form of social visibility. Parish churches were not simply religious spaces. They were community centers where absences became meaningful. To miss Mass repeatedly could provoke questions. To sit in unusual company could attract attention. Even devotional behavior carried social dimensions. And this created another interesting form of medieval privacy: strategic invisibility through conformity. Often the safest way to preserve parts of one's private life was not open rebellion, but outward normality. Attend church appropriately. Maintain expected routines. Avoid drawing excessive attention. Blend into communal rhythms while quietly protecting certain thoughts or relationships beneath the surface. This was especially true for groups living under suspicion or constraint. Jewish communities in medieval Europe, for example, often lived under varying legal restrictions, surveillance, and periodic hostility, depending on region and period. Their lives were simultaneously visible and segregated. Clothing regulations, residential patterns, taxation systems, and religious differences all shaped how privacy operated. Likewise, women navigating patriarchal structures frequently developed careful forms of indirect communication and household influence that operated beneath formal authority. A woman might possess little official power while still managing intricate social networks through kinship, neighborhood relationships, domestic knowledge, and information exchange. Servants, too, occupied peculiar positions between invisibility and intimate knowledge. A servant could move silently through private chambers while remaining socially overlooked. This made servants valuable witnesses and occasionally dangerous ones. Medieval literature and legal records repeatedly show anxiety about overheard conversations, stolen information, or private conduct observed by household staff. And in many cases, servants themselves possessed almost no protected privacy at all. A servant's possessions might fit into a small chest or cloth bundle. Sleep could occur near kitchens, workshops, hallways, or shared lofts. Employers often regulated movement, courtship, and behavior. Young servants especially lived under intense supervision. Yet even within these constraints, people continued creating personal worlds. A ribbon hidden among clothing, a small religious charm, a folded letter, a memory associated with a particular song or prayer. Historians sometimes overlook how emotionally significant tiny possessions could become in societies where physical privacy was scarce. Objects carried inward meaning. The same was true of gardens. In monasteries, castles, manor houses, and urban homes fortunate enough to possess enclosed outdoor space, gardens often offered partial withdrawal from communal pressure. Not complete solitude, certainly, but softer environments where conversation, reflection, prayer, or courtship could occur with slightly greater intimacy. Medieval literature repeatedly associates gardens with secrecy, longing, contemplation, and emotional honesty. A garden wall created one of the rare medieval boundaries between public movement and selective access. But even gardens remained socially layered. Servants worked there. Visitors entered. Neighbors overlooked walls. Complete privacy stayed elusive. And then there were windows, Modern people rarely think about windows as social instruments, but in medieval towns they mattered enormously. Open shutters connected homes directly to street life. People watched processions, markets, arguments, punishments, and celebrations through them. News traveled vertically between upper stories and crowded lanes below. At night, candlelight visible through windows could reveal occupancy, wealth, activity, or secrecy. A lit room at unusual hours might attract curiosity. Closed shutters themselves could seem suspicious under certain circumstances. The medieval house was not sealed from the street. It breathed into it continuously. This permeability shaped crime as well. Theft often depended upon intimate knowledge of households. Neighbors knew routines. Servants knew storage places. Apprentices understood workshop schedules. Doors and locks existed, certainly, but many buildings remained vulnerable by modern standards. Security depended heavily on community awareness. Night watchmen patrolled some towns, listening as much as looking. Unusual sounds mattered. A broken shutter, footsteps at improper hours, raised voices. The urban night was monitored acoustically. At the same time, darkness gave people opportunities they lacked during daylight. Lovers arranged meetings. Smugglers moved goods. Political conspirators whispered in taverns. Young men wandered after curfew. Prostitutes worked streets authorities struggled to fully regulate. The medieval town after dark possessed an entirely different emotional texture from the daylight market world. And because lighting remained limited, shadows carried psychological weight. A narrow lane lit only by occasional torchlight or moonlight felt genuinely uncertain. Sounds traveled strangely. Shapes disappeared into darkness quickly. Medieval fear of the night was not merely superstition. Darkness reduced the community's ability to observe itself. That loss of visibility unsettled authorities repeatedly. Curfews in many towns were partly attempts to restore order by controlling movement after dark. Gates closed. Fires were regulated. Watches were organized. But enforcement remained imperfect. Cities and towns contained too many overlapping lives, ambitions, and hidden desires to become fully transparent. Which brings us to one of the deepest truths about medieval privacy. It was never entirely absent because human beings continually recreate it, even under restrictive conditions. People lower their voices instinctively. They seek trusted company. They preserve memories privately. They conceal fears. They negotiate boundaries. Medieval people did all these things constantly. The difference was that privacy depended less on architecture or law, and more on relationships, hierarchy, custom, and material circumstance. A modern person might secure privacy by locking a door. A medieval person often secured it through timing, trust, reputation, or silence. And silence itself could become remarkably sophisticated. In court records, chronicles, and household accounts, historians sometimes glimpse the spaces where people intentionally chose not to expose one another. A community might quietly tolerate an unconventional arrangement because economic stability mattered more than moral enforcement. A priest might avoid public scandal to preserve peace. A family might protect one of its members through collective denial. People understood that exposing every truth could damage the entire social fabric. This is perhaps why medieval societies often appear contradictory to modern eyes. They could be intensely intrusive while also highly tolerant in practice under certain circumstances. Official rules and lived reality frequently diverged. A town council might condemn disorder publicly while privately accepting that taverns, informal partnerships, gambling, prostitution, and quiet corruption were woven into urban life. A village might harshly punish one scandal while ignoring another nearly identical situation because personal relationships altered communal judgment. Privacy then became selective and unequal. The wealthy purchased more of it. Men often possessed more social freedom within it. Clergy navigated different expectations around it. Outsiders suffered from its absence more severely. Women, servants, migrants, and the poor lived under heavier observation while possessing fewer means to withdraw from it. And yet, even kings struggled to fully escape the gaze of others. Royal households remained crowded ecosystems of service and ambition. A monarch's waking, dressing, eating, hunting, worshipping, and sleeping all involved attendance. Court factions competed for proximity because access itself generated influence. Rumors spread rapidly through palaces. Intimate weakness could become political vulnerability. In some ways, the medieval ruler may have been among the least private people in society. And as royal governments slowly expanded record-keeping, taxation, law enforcement, and administrative systems toward the later medieval centuries, entirely new tensions began emerging between personal life and institutional observation. Because for the first time in many regions, it was no longer only neighbors, servants, and priests who watched closely. States themselves were beginning to learn how to watch too. And as royal governments slowly expanded record-keeping, taxation, law enforcement, and administrative systems toward the later medieval centuries, entirely new tensions began emerging between personal life and institutional observation. Because for centuries, most scrutiny had been intensely local. Your neighbors watched you. Your priest knew your habits. Your lord or manor court understood your obligations. Surveillance, if we can even use that word carefully in a medieval context, was personal, immediate, and rooted in human familiarity. But gradually, written bureaucracy began extending power beyond face-to-face relationships. At first, these systems were still limited by modern standards. Medieval governments lacked anything close to contemporary administrative reach. Yet even modest increases in record-keeping changed how people experienced authority. Tax rolls, censuses, legal registers, property records, guild regulations, and parish documentation all slowly transformed personal details into information that could travel beyond the village or household. A peasant's obligations might now exist not only in memory and custom, but on parchment. A merchant's debts could follow him between towns. A dispute once handled informally among neighbors might become part of a written legal process. Names, landholdings, marriages, inheritances, and financial duties increasingly entered systems larger than immediate community memory. And writing has a different kind of permanence than gossip. A rumor changes shape as it moves from mouth to mouth. A written accusation can linger. This did not mean medieval governments suddenly became all-seeing institutions. Far from it. Communication remained slow. Records were incomplete. Corruption, local resistance, illiteracy, and distance limited enforcement constantly. But something important had begun to shift. Power no longer depended entirely on physically witnessing behavior. Information itself could travel. For ordinary people, this could feel both protective and threatening. Written charters might preserve rights. Contracts could formalize agreements. Legal records sometimes protected widows, merchants, tenants, or apprentices against arbitrary treatment. At the same time, increased documentation made individuals more legible to authority. And perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in taxation. Taxes required knowledge. Rulers needed to know who owned land, who produced goods, who inherited property, who traded successfully, and who could be compelled to contribute financially. Entire administrative systems grew around making medieval populations more visible. The irony, of course, is that medieval rulers often struggled desperately to gather accurate information. People concealed wealth whenever possible. Merchants underreported profits. Villagers resisted intrusive officials. Local elites manipulated records. Communities protected one another selectively. The desire for privacy did not disappear simply because governments became more organized. If anything, administrative growth increased the value of concealment. Hidden income, undeclared property, unofficial arrangements, secret agreements, and quiet exemptions became ordinary features of medieval economic life. The gap between official knowledge and lived reality remained enormous. And because medieval communication still depended heavily on human intermediaries, privacy often hinged on relationships with scribes, clerks, priests, and local officers. A sympathetic official might overlook something. A hostile one might expose it. This made information deeply personal. Modern people sometimes imagine bureaucracy as cold and impersonal, but medieval administration remained entangled with human networks. Documents were carried physically. Records were copied by hand. Local testimony mattered constantly. Memory and paperwork overlapped. A clerk's interpretation could shape outcomes significantly, and literacy itself continued to influence privacy in subtle ways. The ability to read privately remained relatively uncommon for much of the medieval period, especially among poorer populations. This meant written communication still possessed an aura of controlled access. A sealed letter suggested restricted knowledge. A locked document chest implied importance. Legal and religious texts concentrated informational power in educated hands. Yet literacy was expanding gradually in towns, courts, monasteries, and commercial environments. Merchants especially depended increasingly on written records, contracts, correspondence, and accounting systems. Trade required memory beyond the spoken word, and written memory altered trust. In earlier village culture, reputation might depend heavily on what people remembered hearing about someone. In commercial towns, written agreements slowly gained authority alongside oral testimony. This created subtle changes in personal relationships. A handshake still mattered, but a document mattered too. The medieval merchant, therefore, inhabited an especially interesting position between privacy and exposure. Successful trade depended on reputation, visibility, and social trust. Merchants needed people to know their reliability. But commerce also encouraged confidentiality. Pricing strategies, supplier relationships, debts, shipping routes, and political connections all carried value. Information became economically useful. A merchant might discuss one matter openly in the marketplace while carefully guarding another behind closed doors. Business secrecy expanded alongside commercial sophistication. And with that came new anxieties. Forgery, counterfeit seals, intercepted letters, falsified contracts, and hidden financial arrangements all became increasingly serious concerns in later medieval society. The more valuable information became, the more carefully people tried to control access to it. At the same time, urban governments grew more interested in regulating behavior inside homes themselves. Fire regulations, sanitation rules, guild standards, curfews, market inspections, and public morality laws all pushed authorities deeper into domestic life. Medieval towns were vulnerable places. Fires spread rapidly. Disease moved through crowded districts. Public disorder threatened trade and stability, so officials monitored. Inspectors examined weights and measures. Night watches listened for disturbances. Guilds investigated unauthorized labor. Church courts heard disputes involving marriage, morality, and personal conduct. Privacy increasingly collided with institutional concerns about order. But enforcement remained inconsistent because medieval life itself resisted neat control. A narrow alley might contain respectable artisans, informal workers, migrants, widows renting beds, apprentices, prostitutes, itinerant laborers, and small-scale traders, all within a few doors of one another. Official categories rarely captured lived complexity fully, and medieval people became adept at navigating those gaps. An unmarried couple might present themselves publicly in one way while privately maintaining another arrangement. Informal economies flourished beside regulated trade. Families concealed kinship disputes from authorities until absolutely necessary. Entire communities sometimes protected local customs against outside interference. Privacy often survived through collective cooperation rather than individual isolation. This was especially true in poorer neighborhoods, where survival depended heavily on shared knowledge and mutual tolerance. People borrowed food, tools, labor, and money constantly. They cared for one another's children. They shared ovens, wells, courtyards, and workspaces. Under such conditions, complete secrecy was impossible. But selective discretion became essential. A neighbor might know perfectly well that someone was hiding unpaid debts, sheltering a relative unofficially, or violating certain moral expectations. Yet, exposing those realities could destabilize the social balance everyone depended upon. Medieval communities often tolerated contradictions because strict enforcement of every rule would have made ordinary life unmanageable. This practical flexibility surprises many modern listeners because medieval Europe is often imagined as uniformly rigid. In reality, daily life involved constant negotiation between ideals and necessities. The Church taught moral standards that many people sincerely respected. Secular authorities imposed regulations. Communities valued reputation. Yet ordinary people still improvised continuously around the edges of official expectations. And improvisation required hidden spaces. Not always physical spaces, though those mattered too, but social spaces. Ambiguity, silence, plausible deniability, unasked questions. In some ways, medieval privacy functioned less as a stable condition and more as a series of temporary permissions granted by others. A household allowed certain conversations to remain unspoken publicly. A neighborhood agreed not to scrutinize every visitor too closely. A priest chose pastoral discretion over formal punishment. A guild overlooked minor violations to preserve economic stability. This system could be compassionate, but also deeply unequal. Powerful individuals enjoyed wider margins for secrecy. Nobles could hide scandals more effectively than peasants. Wealth purchased thicker walls, legal influence, and controlled access. A respected merchant might survive rumors that would destroy a servant girl's reputation instantly. Women remained especially vulnerable to unequal scrutiny. A man moving freely through taverns or streets at night might attract little notice. A woman doing the same could provoke suspicion quickly depending on context, class, and location. Female privacy was often constrained not only by architecture, but by social expectations surrounding honor and sexuality. Yet women also created intricate private networks of communication and support beneath formal structures. Female friendships, kinship ties, neighborhood relationships, and domestic cooperation formed important channels of information and emotional survival. The medieval household itself often revolved around women's invisible management of social knowledge. Who was feuding with whom? Which neighbor required help? Which family was struggling financially? Which marriage negotiations were developing quietly? Which servant could be trusted? Which priest was discreet? Which merchant extended credit fairly? Much of this knowledge circulated informally through conversation, observation, and memory. And because women frequently managed food preparation, childcare, washing, nursing, and household exchange, they occupied central positions within these intimate information networks. This is one reason gossip cannot simply be dismissed as trivial chatter in medieval society. Gossip functioned as social intelligence. It regulated behavior, protected reputations, transmitted warnings, reinforced norms, and occasionally destroyed lives. To modern ears, the word sounds petty. In medieval communities, it could shape survival. And survival itself remained deeply collective. Harvest failures, storms, illness, political violence, and economic instability meant few people could rely solely on individual independence. A person isolated from community support faced enormous danger. Privacy therefore existed in constant tension with belonging. To disappear socially was not always freedom. Sometimes it meant vulnerability, exile, or suspicion. This helps explain why medieval punishments often emphasized exclusion so heavily. Banishment, excommunication, public humiliation, and social disgrace carried terrifying power because they severed communal ties. A person stripped of social trust lost more than reputation. They lost practical protection. At the same time, some individuals actively sought distance from communal life despite the risks. Hermits withdrew into forests or remote cells. Wandering scholars moved between cities. Mercenaries lived transient lives untethered to stable villages. Pilgrims embraced temporary anonymity on distant roads. Sailors vanished into commercial networks stretching far beyond local memory. These figures fascinated medieval imagination partly because they escaped ordinary scrutiny, at least temporarily. But freedom from surveillance carried uncertainty too. Travelers entering unfamiliar towns lacked the protective familiarity of known identity. Without references or reputation, a stranger could become vulnerable quickly. Inns, marketplaces, and ports therefore developed their own cultures of cautious observation. People watched newcomers carefully. Where was he from? Why had she arrived alone? Did they possess letters of introduction? Could they pay honestly? Were they fleeing something? Mobility created possibility but also distrust. And by the later medieval centuries, Europe itself was becoming more mobile. Trade expanded. Universities drew students across regions. Armies moved constantly. Pilgrimage routes connected distant communities. Maritime commerce linked ports through increasingly dense economic systems. This movement complicated older forms of local observation. In a small village, identity rested heavily on memory. In larger urban and commercial worlds, identity increasingly depended on documentation, affiliations, recommendation, and institutional recognition. Guild membership, university credentials, merchant partnerships, legal seals, and written references all gained importance. The medieval world was slowly becoming too large for purely personal surveillance. And yet daily life remained physically crowded in ways modern listeners still might find exhausting. Shared beds persisted. Thin walls persisted. Household labor persisted. Public punishment persisted. The sounds of neighbors, animals, trade, bells, arguments, prayers, and work continued filling medieval streets and homes from before dawn until deep into the night. The smell of cooking fires drifted through entire neighborhoods. Church bells marked time collectively rather than privately. Water had to be carried publicly. Waste disposal remained communal. Washing often happened visibly. Labor itself unfolded in open view. Medieval people learned to live among constant sensory overlap. And perhaps that is the deepest difference of all. Modern privacy often depends upon controlled separation. Individualized rooms, personalized schedules, sealed infrastructure, anonymous institutions, and technological barriers that allow people to withdraw almost completely from immediate communal awareness. Medieval people rarely possessed such separation. Instead, they developed social instincts for surviving closeness. They learned when to lower their voices, when to pretend not to notice, when to protect another person's dignity through silence, when to expose wrongdoing publicly, when to trust, when to conceal. Privacy existed, but it floated delicately inside human relationships rather than solidly inside architecture. And as medieval society moved gradually toward the early modern world, those relationships themselves were beginning to change under the pressure of wealth, literacy, state expansion, religious conflict, and shifting ideas about the individual self. The old communal world of halls, shared fires, crowded households, and endlessly visible daily life was not disappearing overnight. But in subtle ways, room by room, record by record, and habit by habit, people were beginning to imagine what it might mean to close a door and expect the world to remain outside. But in subtle ways, room by room, record by record, and habit by habit, people were beginning to imagine what it might mean to close a door and expect the world to remain outside. That expectation sounds simple to us now, almost invisible. Yet for most of medieval history, the idea would have carried a faint air of luxury, even strangeness. A closed door could suggest secrecy, exclusion, danger, illness, conspiracy, intimacy, or status. It did not automatically imply a harmless desire for personal space. In fact, one of the quieter transformations toward the end of the medieval world was not merely architectural, but psychological. People slowly began to value controlled withdrawal differently. Among elites especially, chambers became more specialized. Instead of enormous multipurpose halls dominating domestic life, wealthier households increasingly favored suites of connected rooms with narrower access. Corridors appeared more frequently in some regions, reducing the need for people to walk directly through one another's spaces. Curtains gave way gradually to heavier partitions and doors designed not simply to separate warmth, but to manage entry itself. Control over access became a visible social statement. To be admitted into someone's private chamber implied trust, rank, or favor. To be excluded implied hierarchy. Courts became obsessed with proximity. The politics of who could enter which room at what hour and under what conditions grew increasingly important. And this tells us something revealing. Privacy was becoming socially valuable precisely because it remained scarce. The medieval nobleman withdrawing into a chamber with selected advisors was not seeking modern solitude in the emotional sense. He was controlling information, limiting audiences, managing vulnerability, separating inner political life from outer ceremonial performance. The same pattern unfolded in merchant households. As trade enriched certain urban families, domestic interiors slowly reflected new ambitions. Wealth allowed homes to expand vertically and horizontally. Individual family members might possess more distinct sleeping areas. Personal furniture increased. Locks improved. Windows became more sophisticated in prosperous districts. Decorative objects accumulated, and objects themselves subtly changed domestic privacy. Personal writing desk, a lockable cabinet, shelves for books, small devotional spaces for private prayer. These items encouraged more individualized habits within the household. Not complete isolation, certainly, but moments of selective retreat. Books were especially important here. As literacy spread gradually beyond monasteries and clerical elites, reading became less exclusively communal. Earlier medieval reading often occurred aloud, even when alone. Silent reading existed, but oral culture dominated many environments. Over time, however, private reading expanded quietly. This mattered because reading creates interior space. A person absorbed in a manuscript withdraws mentally even while remaining physically present. In crowded households, the ability to disappear inwardly through text offered a different form of privacy altogether. Devotional books especially encouraged personal reflection, examination of conscience, and emotional inwardness. And with inwardness came new tensions. The later medieval church increasingly emphasized the condition of the individual soul. Personal intention mattered deeply. Inner belief mattered. Hidden sin mattered. The private self gained spiritual importance even while material life remained highly communal. This could produce profound anxiety. If God saw not only actions, but thoughts themselves, then privacy became spiritually unstable. A person might conceal behavior successfully from neighbors while remaining exposed before divine judgment. Medieval devotional literature often reveals people scrutinizing their own minds intensely, searching for sinful impulses hidden beneath outward appearances. The interior self became morally significant. At the same time, confessional practices encouraged individuals to articulate private experiences verbally. Sins once absorbed silently into communal life now required increasingly detailed examination and disclosure under certain religious frameworks. This is one of the great paradoxes of late medieval privacy. Society gradually became more attentive to inward individuality while simultaneously developing more structured forms of moral observation. And outside the church, secular authorities were also becoming increasingly curious about personal conduct. Sumptuary laws attempted to regulate clothing according to status. Urban governments imposed rules on prostitution, gambling, feasting, sanitation, and commercial behavior. Universities disciplined student conduct. Guilds supervised professional standards and sometimes personal morality among members. The medieval town was becoming administratively denser, but human life continued slipping through regulations in countless ways. Unofficial marriages persisted beside formal church ceremonies. Informal labor escaped guild oversight. Secret financial arrangements flourished. Sexual relationships crossed social boundaries quietly. Hidden religious skepticism existed beneath outward conformity. The gap between official ideals and lived reality remained wide. And because of that gap, medieval people became remarkably skilled at reading indirect signals. An unexpectedly expensive garment, a servant suddenly dismissed, a merchant traveling unusually often, a widow receiving regular visitors, candles burning late into the night, a household growing quieter after dark than usual. Tiny details accumulated social meaning. This sensitivity developed partly because information traveled unevenly. Without newspapers, telephones, or digital communication, communities depended heavily on observation. People learned through fragments, snatches of conversation, visible routines, missing routines, and perhaps nowhere was routine more socially exposed than in labor itself. Modern work often disappears into offices, screens, and specialized spaces separated from domestic life. Medieval labor remained intensely visible. A blacksmith's hammer echoed through the neighborhood. Bakers worked before dawn. Washerwomen gathered publicly near water sources. Builders, porters, fishmongers, brewers, weavers, scribes, cooks, stable hands, and vendors all performed work in spaces where others constantly watched. The body at work was part of communal life. This meant physical exhaustion, injury, aging, and illness also became publicly legible. A craftsman losing strength threatened household stability visibly. A failed harvest altered entire village behavior. Hunger reshaped posture, clothing, movement, and mood in ways neighbors noticed quickly. Privacy around suffering was difficult, and suffering itself often unfolded communally. During harsh winters or food shortages, people did not endure hardship privately behind sealed walls. Entire neighborhoods experienced scarcity together. Bread quality declined visibly. Fires burned lower. Clothing deteriorated. Tempers shortened. Public life carried the marks of collective strain. At the same time, festivals and celebrations interrupted ordinary observation in fascinating ways. Feast days transformed medieval social rhythms. Streets filled. Music spread through towns. Drinking increased. Dancing, games, processions, and temporary reversals of normal hierarchy created unusual freedoms. Carnival traditions in some regions allowed behaviors and expressions that everyday order restricted. These moments could briefly loosen the constant discipline of communal visibility. Masks appeared in certain festivities. Humor targeted authority. Young people mingled more freely. Outsiders entered towns for fairs and markets. The sheer density of movement allowed temporary anonymity within crowds. Yet even festive freedom remained socially structured. Communities understood these occasions as controlled exceptions rather than permanent liberation. Once celebrations ended, ordinary patterns of scrutiny returned. Still, those moments mattered psychologically. They offered release inside societies where behavior was continuously negotiated under observation. The medieval person did not usually possess modern private independence, but they did possess intervals of loosened expectation. And expectations governed nearly everything. How loudly one spoke, how one dressed, when one visited others, who sat beside whom at meals, how grief was displayed, how devotion appeared publicly, whether one appeared industrious enough, whether one maintained acceptable household order. The household itself remained the fundamental moral unit of medieval life. A well-run household reflected discipline, competence, and social worth. Disorder within the home threatened wider communal stability. This helps explain why medieval authorities cared so deeply about marriage, inheritance, servant behavior, and domestic hierarchy. The home was not imagined primarily as a private refuge for individual fulfillment. It was an economic and moral institution embedded within larger social structures. And because households carried so much weight, domestic conflict rarely remained entirely private. Neighbors intervened in disputes. Relatives mediated tensions. Courts heard marital complaints. Priests advised reconciliation. Communities developed expectations about acceptable household conduct because household breakdown affected everyone nearby. This could create extraordinary pressure to maintain appearances. A family facing internal violence or financial collapse might struggle desperately to conceal instability from neighbors. Public exposure threatened reputation, alliances, and survival itself. Silence sometimes protected dignity. Sometimes it protected abuse. And medieval communities understood this ambiguity imperfectly, just as modern societies often do. There is a temptation to imagine pre-modern people as emotionally simpler than ourselves, but surviving records repeatedly challenge that assumption. Medieval letters, poems, legal testimony, and devotional writings reveal people deeply aware of humiliation, loneliness, desire, resentment, tenderness, envy, fear, and private longing. What differed was not the existence of interior life, but the structures surrounding it. A modern individual may retreat physically when distressed. A medieval person often remained surrounded by others almost continuously. Emotional management, therefore, required different habits. People learned to compartmentalize internally while remaining externally engaged in communal routines. This is perhaps why religious retreat held such fascination. Monasteries, anchoritic cells, hermitages, and pilgrimage routes represented alternative relationships to observation and social obligation. Some people sought distance from ordinary communal life not because they hated humanity, but because constant exposure itself could feel spiritually exhausting. Yet even monastic life rarely offered complete solitude. Monks slept in dormitories, ate collectively, prayed in groups, and followed strict schedules. Their withdrawal from ordinary society created a different community rather than pure isolation. Medieval Europe consistently pulled human beings back toward collective structures. And even those collective structures contained layers of secrecy. Monastic politics, court intrigue, merchant alliances, illicit romances, underground religious movements, and informal economies all depended on hidden communication networks. Medieval society was not transparent. It simply possessed fewer reliable barriers between one person's life and another's awareness. This distinction matters. A village might know a great deal about its inhabitants while still misunderstanding them profoundly. Gossip could distort reality. Reputation could harden unfairly. Hidden suffering might remain invisible despite constant proximity. In fact, crowded living sometimes concealed emotional isolation rather than eliminating it. A servant surrounded by people all day could still feel profoundly alone. A noblewoman attended constantly by household staff might possess no trusted confidant. A craftsman working publicly in a busy street might carry private despair unnoticed. Human inwardness survived communal life in complicated ways, and medieval literature occasionally hints at this quieter loneliness. Songs about absent lovers, religious writings about spiritual emptiness, pilgrimage narratives filled with longing, poems describing secrecy, distance, and misunderstood affection. These emotional textures remind us that privacy is not identical to interiority. Medieval people possessed rich inner worlds even when they lacked physical separation. But physical separation still mattered increasingly as the medieval world evolved. The rise of more comfortable urban housing among prosperous classes slowly altered expectations around sleep, conversation, and domestic routine. Separate beds became more common among the wealthy. Individual chambers acquired greater prestige. Furniture diversified. Personal possessions multiplied. And with possessions came stronger ideas about ownership of space itself. A chair belonging specifically to one individual. A writing desk reserved for private correspondence. A cabinet holding personal documents. A room entered only by invitation. These developments unfolded gradually, unevenly, and mostly among elites at first, but they reflected changing assumptions about the self. The individual was becoming more spatially defined. At the same time, Europe was entering periods of deep religious and political upheaval that would make privacy even more complicated. Religious dissent, reform movements, political conspiracies, and expanding state authority all intensified concern over hidden belief and secret communication. Authorities increasingly feared not merely visible rebellion, but concealed disloyalty. What a person truly believed inside their own mind became politically important. And once societies begin worrying seriously about hidden thought, privacy changes fundamentally. No longer merely a matter of sleeping arrangements or household crowding, privacy becomes tied to conscience itself. The line between outward conformity and inward belief grows unstable. Late medieval and early modern Europe would eventually become deeply preoccupied with this problem. How could rulers know whether subjects were loyal? How could churches identify hidden heresy? How could communities distinguish genuine conformity from secret deviation? The answers increasingly involved records, interrogations, surveillance networks, informants, censorship, and institutional oversight that reached further into private life than earlier medieval societies usually could. Yet even then, ordinary people continued finding ways to preserve fragments of hidden selfhood. Behind shutters, inside letters, during travel, in gardens, in taverns, in whispered prayers after others had fallen asleep, in coded language, in trusted friendships, in silence carefully maintained over many years. And perhaps the most revealing thing of all is that medieval people rarely stopped seeking those moments, even in a world where true solitude remained fragile, temporary, and never entirely guaranteed. And perhaps the most revealing thing of all is that medieval people rarely stopped seeking those moments, even in a world where true solitude remained fragile, temporary, and never entirely guaranteed. In some ways, the longing for privacy becomes easier to notice precisely because medieval life made it difficult. A person does not usually dream about air until breathing becomes hard. And throughout medieval society, there are scattered signs that people deeply valued opportunities to withdraw from constant observation whenever circumstances allowed. A noblewoman requesting a more secluded chamber. A monk lingering in a cloister walk after prayers had ended. A merchant building an upper room away from the noise of his workshop below. a scholar rising before dawn simply to read undisturbed for an hour beside a candle. These are small moments, but they matter because they reveal desire rather than mere necessity. And desire itself was changing. By the later medieval centuries, especially in parts of Western Europe experiencing commercial growth and intellectual expansion, ideas about individuality slowly deepened. Universities spread forms of education that encouraged personal interpretation and inward reflection. Urban wealth created new domestic ambitions. Literacy expanded beyond older clerical boundaries. Religious devotion increasingly emphasized the emotional life of the believer. The self became more complicated. Not more human than before, certainly, but more consciously examined. People wrote more about inner conflict, temptation, memory, longing, and personal conscience. Diaries were still rare, but autobiographical awareness strengthened gradually. Private reading expanded. Personal letters carried more emotional nuance. And all of this subtly altered the meaning of being alone. Earlier medieval society often treated solitude with suspicion unless it occurred within approved religious settings. A person isolated from community risked moral and physical danger. Loneliness was not romanticized. Wilderness remained threatening. Roads were unsafe. Strangers were uncertain. Human survival depended heavily on belonging. But over time, some educated and wealthy people began imagining withdrawal not only as spiritual discipline, but as intellectual and emotional comfort. This did not happen suddenly, nor did it reach most ordinary people quickly. Yet the change is visible in architecture, literature, and household practice alike. Rooms themselves began acquiring clearer functions. Instead of one hall serving nearly every purpose, elite homes increasingly divided activities spatially. Sleeping, dining, receiving guests, conducting business, and personal devotion gradually separated into more specialized environments. The process remained uneven and incomplete for centuries, but direction mattered more than speed. The household was becoming internally layered, and once spaces become layered, access becomes negotiable. Who may enter? At what time? For what reason? Must they knock? Must they wait for permission? Questions that modern people barely notice began carrying growing social importance. The knock at the door itself became meaningful. In much of earlier medieval life, movement through domestic space could be relatively fluid, especially among lower classes living in crowded conditions. But as chambers multiplied and personal withdrawal gained prestige, interruption itself became more visible. The boundary between shared life and protected life thickened slowly. Still, this transformation remained deeply unequal. A prosperous merchant family in a growing city might begin experiencing forms of privacy unimaginable to agricultural laborers sharing one heated room through winter. Social class shaped access to silence as much as access to food or education. And even among elites, privacy remained incomplete by modern standards. Servants still entered rooms constantly. Household business continued around the clock. Visitors arrived without modern scheduling expectations. Families remained economically intertwined. Disease, childbirth, mourning, and celebration all still unfolded communally. But expectations matter historically, and expectations were shifting. One of the clearest signs appears in attitudes toward correspondence. Letters increasingly carried emotional intimacy across distance. Lovers, family members, scholars, clergy, merchants, and political allies all depended more heavily on written communication as literacy expanded. And with that came growing concern over interception, secrecy, and trust. Seals became increasingly important. Messengers had to be chosen carefully. Sensitive information moved cautiously. A letter represented something uniquely vulnerable, thoughts detached from the speaker's physical presence. Once words travel independently, privacy changes again. A spoken conversation vanishes into memory. A written letter can be hidden, stolen, copied, preserved, or used as evidence years later. Medieval people understood this well. Courts increasingly relied on documentation. Political intrigue depended upon controlled correspondence. Merchants guarded account books carefully. An ordinary emotional life changed too. A mother writing anxiously to a distant son. A scholar sharing controversial ideas quietly with trusted colleagues. A nobleman conducting delicate negotiations. A woman preserving a private attachment through exchanged notes. Writing allowed parts of the self to exist outside immediate communal observation. But it also created new risks. The medieval world remained profoundly sensitive to hidden communication. Secret meetings, coded letters, concealed alliances, and unauthorized gatherings all attracted suspicion because they bypassed normal communal visibility. Authorities worried constantly about what they could not see. Religious authorities feared concealed heresy. Urban governments feared conspiracy and disorder. Monarchs feared treason. Guilds feared unauthorized competition. Communities feared hidden immorality. The growth of private communication, therefore, produced parallel growth in surveillance and control. And this tension became especially intense during periods of religious upheaval. As reform movements, dissenting groups, and doctrinal conflicts spread through Europe toward the end of the medieval period and beyond, private belief became politically explosive. Outward conformity no longer guaranteed inward loyalty. This created a deeply unsettling problem for authorities. How do you govern thoughts? Earlier medieval society had focused heavily on visible behavior and communal participation. But now rulers and religious institutions increasingly worried about concealed conviction. Secret prayer meetings, forbidden texts, unapproved interpretations of scripture, quiet skepticism hidden beneath outward obedience. The hidden interior self became dangerous in new ways, and ordinary households suddenly acquired political significance. A dinner conversation, a prayer said incorrectly, a hidden manuscript, a suspicious visitor after dark. Domestic space itself could become morally charged territory. This was a world still without modern privacy protections, yet increasingly obsessed with the unseen. And perhaps nowhere does that anxiety appear more clearly than in attitudes toward women's private lives. Throughout medieval society, female reputation remained intensely vulnerable to public interpretation. But as literacy, court culture, and urban sophistication expanded, elite women especially occupied increasingly complicated positions between visibility and concealment. A noble woman might command servants, oversee estates, exchange correspondence, patronize religious institutions, and influence political alliances while still formally operating within restrictive expectations about obedience and chastity. Her chamber could function simultaneously as domestic retreat, administrative center, and social theater. And because female sexuality was linked so strongly to inheritance, legitimacy, and household honor, societies monitored women's movements closely. Who visited? At what hour? Under what supervision? How long did conversations last? Which gifts were exchanged? Even architectural arrangements sometimes reflected these anxieties. Controlled access to women's quarters, household supervision, and expectations around modest conduct all attempted to regulate intimacy spatially. Yet real life rarely obeyed ideal rules perfectly. People fell in love unexpectedly. Servants carried messages. Friendships deepened into hidden attachments. Households developed emotional complexities impossible to regulate fully. The more medieval society attempted to structure reputation externally, the more valuable secrecy became internally. And secrecy itself could feel intoxicating. This appears repeatedly in medieval literature. Hidden gardens, midnight meetings, whispered vows, secret letters concealed inside devotional books or clothing chests, lovers speaking through windows or beneath staircases. These stories resonated precisely because ordinary life remained so exposed. Privacy acquired emotional charge through scarcity. At the same time, medieval people also feared excessive secrecy deeply. Hidden spaces invited suspicion because they threatened communal transparency. Taverns, forests, private chambers, locked studies, and unfamiliar houses all attracted moral anxiety in certain contexts. This helps explain why the medieval world often oscillates strangely between openness and concealment. Daily bodily life remained extraordinarily public by modern standards. Yet emotional and political secrecy could become intensely elaborate. Communities tolerated astonishing physical closeness while simultaneously fearing hidden intentions. And hidden intentions mattered because trust remained personal rather than institutional for most people. A modern individual may trust systems, banks, contracts, police forces, bureaucracies, digital records. Medieval people relied far more heavily on human reputation. The trustworthy merchant, the honorable priest, the dependable neighbor, the discreet servant, the loyal relative. This made betrayal deeply intimate. A stolen secret was rarely abstract. It moved through actual human relationships. Someone overheard something. Someone spoke carelessly. Someone chose loyalty elsewhere. Information traveled along social pathways rather than anonymous networks. And because communities were smaller and more interconnected, memory lasted longer. A scandal could follow a person for years. A family dispute might survive across generations. A broken engagement, unpaid debt, public insult, or whispered accusation could linger in communal consciousness long after the original event faded. Privacy, therefore, depended partly on controlling memory itself. People negotiated which stories survived publicly and which disappeared quietly. Some events became local legend. Others dissolved into silence through mutual agreement. Medieval society constantly balanced between remembering and forgetting. Religious ritual reinforced this balance in fascinating ways. Confession allowed sins to be spoken privately, but penance often restored communal order publicly. A person might reveal hidden wrongdoing confidentially while still performing visible acts of repentance afterward. The goal was not purely individual relief. It was reintegration into moral community. This distinction is crucial. Modern privacy often assumes personal autonomy as its foundation. Medieval privacy usually remained relational. The question was not simply what belongs only to me, but what must be concealed, revealed, forgiven, ignored, or managed in order for society to continue functioning. And society depended heavily on cooperation because material life remained fragile. Crop failures still threatened famine. Epidemics still returned unpredictably. Fires devastated crowded towns rapidly. War displaced populations. Childbirth remained dangerous. Illness could destroy household stability within weeks. Under such conditions, total individual independence remained unrealistic for most people. Human beings needed one another too directly, which may be why medieval hospitality carried such moral weight. Travelers depended on strangers regularly. Pilgrims sought lodging. Merchants required safe passage. Guests entered households with expectations of food, warmth, and protection. To deny hospitality entirely risked moral condemnation. But hospitality also reduced privacy further. A stranger might sleep beside family members in the hall. Travelers exchanged news near household fires. Servants accommodated unfamiliar guests. Information moved continually across domestic thresholds. And yet, hospitality simultaneously expanded the world. Stories arrived from distant regions. News of wars, miracles, trade opportunities, disasters, royal politics, and religious controversies traveled through wandering human voices. Medieval people did not inhabit isolated silence. They lived inside dense verbal cultures. Conversation itself became a form of communal infrastructure. People gathered in workshops, markets, churches, taverns, mills, and courtyards not only for labor or ritual, but for information exchange. Much of medieval social life depended upon spoken circulation. To withdraw entirely from communal conversation could become socially dangerous. And this perhaps explains why modern people sometimes misunderstand medieval privacy so completely. We often imagine privacy as inherently comforting and communal exposure as inherently oppressive. Medieval people experienced both realities differently because survival, identity, and emotional life remained intertwined with visible participation in community. The crowded hall could feel exhausting, but also reassuring. Shared sleeping arrangements could feel uncomfortable, but also warm and secure. The constant awareness of neighbors could feel intrusive, but also protective during crisis. The absence of privacy created suffering, certainly. Gossip ruined lives. Social scrutiny constrained individuality. Domestic crowding intensified stress. Vulnerable people, especially women and servants, often possessed little control over their own space or bodies. Yet the same communal world also created forms of belonging modern societies sometimes struggle to reproduce. A widow rarely grieved entirely alone. A sick household attracted visitors. Hunger became collectively visible. Work happened beside others. Childhood unfolded within broad webs of observation and care. The individual self remained embedded in shared rhythms from dawn until nightfall. And perhaps that is why, even as medieval society slowly moved toward greater privacy, people approached the change with ambivalence. Because closing a door protects, but it also separates. And the medieval world, for all its noise, exposure, and relentless closeness, understood something modern life occasionally forgets. That the human need to be left alone and the human fear of being left alone are not the same thing at all. And perhaps that tension, more than any single detail about castles or cottages or crowded medieval streets, is what still feels strangely familiar across the centuries. The medieval world was loud where modern life is quiet, shared where modern life is separated, observed where modern life often disappears behind doors, passwords, and private screens. Most people slept beside others, worked beside others, prayed beside others, suffered beside others, and aged beneath the constant awareness of family, neighbors, servants, clergy, and local authority. For long stretches of history, privacy was not something ordinary people expected from the structure of life itself. It had to be improvised out of curtains, silence, timing, trusted friendships, dark roads, hidden letters, prayer, memory, and the small mercies of other people choosing not to look too closely. And yet, medieval people were never simply passive victims of exposure. They protected secrets. They cultivated inner lives. They carved out moments of solitude where they could. They fell in love privately inside crowded towns. They confessed hidden fears. They concealed grief behind ordinary routines. They created emotional distance even when physical distance was impossible. The more closely we look, the harder it becomes to say medieval people had no privacy in any absolute sense. What they lacked was not inwardness, but insulation. The walls were thinner. The household was fuller. The community stood nearer. Life itself happened in public more often than many of us can comfortably imagine. But the desire for boundaries was already there, quietly growing. Inside monasteries and merchant homes, behind noble chambers and urban workshops, in locked chests and private correspondence, medieval Europe was slowly beginning to invent new expectations about personal space, hidden thought, and controlled access to the self. Not all at once, not evenly, but steadily enough that, over generations, people began treating solitude less as an unusual privilege and more as something desirable in its own right. And eventually, those small changes would reshape architecture, family life, politics, religion, and even the modern understanding of individuality itself. Because once people begin believing they deserve a room of their own, a conversation unheard, a letter unread, a thought unexamined, or a life not entirely visible to the surrounding world, history starts moving in a different direction. Still, there is something worth sitting with before we leave the medieval firelight behind. For all the discomfort of constant closeness, medieval people also inhabited a world where loneliness was harder to hide. Neighbors noticed absence. Families shared burdens physically. Illness unfolded in company. Meals gathered people together by necessity. Human beings remained woven tightly into one another's daily survival. Modern life solved many of the hardships of medieval exposure. It gave millions of people safety, autonomy, dignity, rest, and control that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. But it also created new forms of distance. And perhaps that is why the medieval world still feels so compelling to modern audiences at night, long after the castles have crumbled and the bells have gone silent. Beneath the strange customs and crowded halls, we recognize something deeply human. The endless balancing act between wanting to belong and wanting to disappear for a while, between needing other people close by and needing, every so often, a door that closes softly behind us. If you made it this far, I'd genuinely love to know what detail stayed with you most, or what part of medieval life felt hardest to imagine living through. And if you enjoy these quieter deep dives into the past, you can always subscribe and return for another journey through history together. Until next time, sleep well.